Global University. We have here we have this ongoing effort, some of us, to bring together those who are interested in political economy and economic history. In order to launch this, we have someone who claims not to be an economic historian, in the sense that he wouldn't publish in the Journal of Modern History, and he doesn't do econometrics. What he does do is he thinks about economic categories. So he's an economic historian 30 years ago, and something we're trying to renew, meaning he thinks about that. And I think it's the way that a lot of us have been wanting to go increasingly. I think there are a lot of people in the history department and in the Russian department who have been trying to go in that direction. Alessandro has a peculiar training. He has two PhDs, one from Naples and the other from Paris. He worked with Leo Hameson. Was Leo Hameson your advisor for the second?
For the second, yes.
The second dissertation, yeah. Which is where I actually got to know Alessandro, because I was at Columbia at the time. And he's since then he's been writing. He's supposed to be a specialist on Russia, which he says. He's written on the economic history of India, labor history in France. He's been writing about British intellectual history more recently. On Friday, he treated us to a piece in which he's talking about simultaneously Jeremy Bentham, India, Russia, and Britain in a project that I think is successful. And he's been finding those things, in other words, can allow us to speak, let's call it transnationally or globally, which we discussed earlier. We don't know what it means, but if it means anything, Alessandro knows what it is. Today he's going to speak to us about another basic category, which is the question of backwardness, which, as you know, is one of the animating themes in all sorts of histories, not only the history of Russia. And he'll lecture to us for about 40 minutes, and after that we can talk about it. Okay. Alessandro, thank you for coming.
Okay. Thank you, Andy, so much for the invitations. You have not talked so much about our age and the fact that we were together less than 30 years ago. Come on. So, a little bit less. So thank you so much for coming. What I want to do today is it's just a little conversation with you about a way of discussing about Russia. I don't know whether it's a global perspective. I'm not a world historian. You know that there are several discussions about the global. Sometimes it's a little bit boring. There are new religious wars about whether you are transnational or global versus transnational. Once in Paris, I started saying that these kind of debates or discussions can be perfectly translated into Napolitan, which was my original language, not Italian, the Napolitan dialect. We have a word for this, which is called the puticarelle. Puticarelle is an intellectual category in Naples, which means in French petite querelle, which is small debates about anything. Which means, for example, do I pay or do I pay? No, please, I must pay. Please, so useless, absolutely useless. And the religious wars about transnational or global are kind of puticarelle. So it's very good for having some time in a coffee bar, but a little bit less interesting here. So I don't want to talk about what is the global, but I'm going to talk about how to discuss about Russia, maybe in an interesting way, because what I'm trying to do since some years is to escape. After I escaped the economic historians, I escaped the Department of Russian History because I wanted to discuss also with other people and also on topics trans areas. So that's what I'm trying to do, and I'm affiliated to two centers in order to more or less get free. So what I want to show is the following. The first is you can see this is something very interesting. It's from 2011 is about the future explosion of the Russian Federation. You have a lot of, this is absolutely not new. In the 90s we have full of colleagues here in New York, but also everywhere in Paris, saying that next week the Russian Federation will explode. And if you read the papers of this decade, it was full of this. Everybody said, you see, next week they will not exist anymore. You know, there's Yeltsin, he drank, so everybody will be finishing very soon. And this is extremely interesting because this idea, you can find this idea, at least from the diplomatic sources, since the second half of the 17th century. It's extremely interesting. As soon as Kiev, then Muscovy, started expanding, several other diplomatic forces say, okay, they are expanding, but they are kind of Mongols. In a couple of years, they will be out. And you find the same concern immediately after Peter's death by saying, you know, Peter was a smart guy, he knew something about Europe, and now Russia will explode. And you have the same argument in the 19th century with Napoleon, and after the Crimean War, finally, everybody was waiting, you will see Russia will explode. Of course, after the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution, everybody was waiting for a couple of weeks, no more, because they didn't know economics, and they were killing all the best people in the country, so they should explode, they cannot resist. And this was during all the time. And this is extremely interesting, because to a given extent, you have this attitude. This is the soccer. I come from Europe, so I need soccer. It's extremely interesting because since 3 centuries and a half, you have a lot of discussions about the future explosion of Russia. They can't resist. And this is so because according to, and coming back to this or another theory, politics, economics even more, they should not be there. According to what they do, they are supposed to explode. And the problem is that they don't. And of course, the problem is, the question is why? A very basic answer say, because they are big. Of course, this is not an answer. The question is why they are big and why they can resist with such a big space. We have exactly the opposite theory when discussing about China, arguing that they should explode, they could not control because it was too big. So, this is just a tautology. And the Champions League is extremely interesting for the following reason. Because if you look at the interviews that presidents from Milan, Berlusconi, or from Barcelona, or from Real Madrid or Bayern argue every year is, it's not important for us to win the Champions League. The most important is to be in the last four, because we get money and we are always there. Now, if you look, despite this, and despite the CAI argument of the 50s that Russia was the best, which was not, but despite this, over 3 centuries and a half, among the last of the best, called as you want, 5th or 6th countries in the world, you always find Russia. You have Britain at the moment, and not after this. You have the US since the 20th century and after this. At another moment you have this country and another one. But in the last group, you always have Russia, never probably the first or the second, but they are always there. And even in the 90s, everybody was waiting for the explosion, and today nobody can do something if Putin, despite all the weakness, doesn't say yes. And my question is, why is it so? Why there is such a discrepancy between our perceptions over centuries and the fact that Russia, despite our theories, it's always there, and it's even strong and stronger than it's supposed to be, according to any kind of theory. That's why I find interesting to discuss Russia, because it has always been used to give answers, probably much more our fears than something else. And we always know that it can be there because there is despotism, because the economy doesn't work. We always know the answer. And the problem is that if there is a country for which we don't ask many questions, because we already know, it's Russia. So I would like to reverse the angle and try to ask why is it so, and what we can ask the Russian history, and also why Russian history, once it's open that way, it's extremely, it has an extremely powerful heuristic to also understand other countries. It's the way I'm trying to sell the Russian field to non-Russianists, because nobody cares anymore. I'll say, listen, if you really ask questions to Russia, you can better understand a lot of other stuff. And so that's what I'm trying to do today. So this is, you have full of cards like this. It's the reverse of the previous one. This is the expansion, and to show how it became bigger and bigger over time. And again, why was it so? I did something on the military history. Even there, they should have never been there. They were able to win again Poland, Lithuania, which was the best, and Sweden, and after all the rest. And in principle, they should have been soundly beaten, but they were not. So there is something interesting. Okay, this is for the economist. So I'm trying to go back to the principal explanations of how Russia works and the categories that we use to explain Russia. And it's extremely interesting that most of the economic but also political categories we have since 3 centuries, since the Enlightenment, and even more during Cold War, so over 3 centuries, even if they are international or global categories, they are much often inspired by Russia themselves. I use the case of Gershon. His idea of backwardness was directly related to the development theories of the 50s, but indirectly inspired by his own vision of Russia. And this is so for many other categories that we use, and I'm coming back in a moment to each of these categories. So, the different categories. It's extremely interesting. First, since the 18th century, we have this idea of backwardness, and I'm coming back in a moment. Backwardness, what does it mean? For if you take Gershon, he does a very interesting approach to backwardness. The title is Economic Backwardness in Historical Perspective. And this is extremely important because you have two different notions of time in the title itself, and these different notions of time are hardly compatible between them. On one hand, you have backwardness, which is a logical time. You have one notion of time. Along the line, you have the different countries. You have an idea of what development is, and on one hand, you have Britain, his idea of Britain, not necessarily historical Britain. And after you ask, okay, what is missing there? And you have backwardness and Russia, which is before this. And in order to escape the line, as you know, it says, okay, if you miss some factors, you must jump by using the state, for example. But to say this, you need a line of time and an idea of who is before and who is after this. And of course, in this case, you are using an economic logical notion of time, which is not necessarily compatible with an historian notion of time made of different opportunities, choice, but also multiple lines of time, and not only one single, as in economics, in particular in development economics. Now, this idea of time is not an invention of Gershon, of course. It comes out even from the 18th century, when precisely Montesquieu, Diderot, and many others started talking about le retard and the backwardness of a different civilization, as they say, starting from the Enlightenment. So we have an old tradition about the notion of backwardness, well before the recent economic thought, and started in the Enlightenment. And it's precisely over these 3 centuries that we should try to understand why the success of these notions, and which is the role of Russia and then Soviet Union in developing these different notions. So you have the backwardness coming from the 18th century. We have, again, I'm coming back in a moment, to Asian despotism that Montesquieu itself developed in Les Esprits des Lois. And I will come back. Much more than the Chinese example that now is fashionable, Montesquieu referred to Russia to discuss about the Asian despotism. And of course, you have all the Marxist historiography of the 19th century with the idea, extremely interesting, that on one hand you have one single path of development, but at the same time, as you know, the old Marx developed another idea, when discussing with Verzasowicz about what about Russia in the Obshchina Is it one single path, or it's possible to have a different path to modernity? And as you know, the last Marx said, maybe you can escape the one single path. Of course, Kautsky put beside this, revisionists in Russia re-included the different path, Lenin moved from one to another, but still, there was precisely this tension about one single line or a different line, and again, the reflection started with Russia, even for revisionism and for Marxism, of course. And on the contrary, on the 20th century, you have something completely different, a radicalization of the opposition between the Western and the Eastern path, and the road to serfdom as a deterministic way. It was Hayek, but at the same time, as you know, we tend to have, concerning Russia, a confusion between the liberal thought of the 19th century and the neoliberal thought of the 20th century. The radicalization of this approach, it's something which is related, as you know, to the Austrian school, and it's embedded in the debate between the plan and the market. And the fact that we bring together the 19th and 20th century liberal traditions in one single box, it's a major problem. It's a major problem because they do not belong to the wholesale tradition. I always take the example of Barras, which is put with the neoclassical. Barras was a socialist. And this is a little bit forgotten. He considered himself a socialist. He was a member of the Socialist Party. And this idea was to have a general model to prove the scientific approach to Marxism. That is why Marx himself got mad with him, because he tried the same epistemological solution to have a scientific representation of the economy and not just a utopia. And this was put beside by both the socialist and the liberal by trying to hide the socialist background of Barras. So there is something completely different in the 19th century compared to the 20th century when we discuss about economies, liberalism, and Russia. And the road to serfdom hides completely this different approach. So, the last heritage, so with backwardness, I'm coming back to the 18th century in a moment. So if we have backwardness and the evolution over the 20th century, the development and Coercion, the most interesting to me is that even nowadays, in comparative economic history, there are huge difficulties in putting Russia in an appropriate way into the scheme. I take the example of the most successful global economic historian during the last 10 years, Ken Pomerantz's Great Divergence. So Ken is a friend, and we discussed several times of this. If you take Pomerantz's scheme, what you have, the argument that China and England were at the same level until the early 19th century, and the divergence was related not to different institutions, but to colonialism and to in particular, the states background, the United States, the American environment, markets, resources, and so on and so forth. And this idea is that the West could exploit the Americas, while the poor China was put down by the fact that half of Asia was in the hands of Russia with the despotism and serfdom. So, despite the fact that they completely reversed the angle and say, look, China is not what you think, Russia is what you think. So, it prefers to preserve the idea of Russia. So, China was absolutely competitive. They had the real markets more than Britain, as you know, but Russians were just despotism and serfdom. So it's interesting because even with the very reversal angle of nowadays, with the great divergence, Russia is still there. So it's extremely interesting, no questions about Russia, and that's why I think time has come to re-bring Russia in a conversation with other area studies in order to ask some questions. Which questions? The first question, as you know, is about the Enlightenment. I need this guy, but probably before, yes. Okay. The role of the state is the first. The role of the state is, of course, a long tendency in Russian history, and it's a little bit paradoxical in Russian studies. On one hand, you explain the feature of Russia because of the weight of the state everywhere. And at the same time, everybody says, yes, but the Tsar state was very weak, they're not real power. And for many people, except for the Stalin period, the same was true for Soviet Union. They say the state everywhere, but the state was weak. So there is a little bit a tautology there. We evoke the state all the time to explain Russia and Soviet Union, and we evoke at the same time the huge burden of the state and the weakness of the state. So from an analytical point of view, there is something which does not fit very well in these explanations. Let us take the idea by which we compare state formations and their strength. As you know, the basic comparative approach to this are extremely influenced by Weber on one hand and Tilly following Weber on the other hand. So Russia and Soviet Union fall on the Asian part of it because it's not only Vogel, it's also Tilly, because there is a lot of coercion and no capital. You know the scheme. And on the contrary, Europe is a lot of capital and no coercion. So it's interesting to try to put this scheme into an appropriate historical approach. And you have, if you enter into details, you have something which is interesting. First, from a logical point of view, this is just a tautology. Tilly starts from the end, so you have the nation state somewhere in Europe, and they move backward to explain why this must be successful. And the attributes to the European states features that historians of Britain, of France, even of Spain, do not accept anymore. The lack of coercion and the major importance of capital. And empirically also, as you know, the fact that there was no capital in Asia is now extremely contested by sinologists, and of course even in the steppe, as you know, all the new literature about the Mongols and capitals in the steppe and so on and so forth does not fit with this traditional position. So if this is so, how can discuss in any way once we break up this conventional model opposing the coercion and state in the East and the West? How do we bring more coercion in the West and more capital in the East, in concrete? I tried to do, but so I'm not entering details, otherwise we're going on for years. But so, I tried to do with just a small points of view, which is first the financing the war between the 16th and the 18th century in different parts of Eurasia. And there is something extremely interesting. The first is that unlike our normal perceptions about war destroying trade, this is not always true. In inner Asia, and so when during the Muscovy expansion, trade was secured and was even expanding during all the inner Asia in their connections with Asia on one hand, South Asia on the other hand, and Europe on the third route. So we have different scattered confirmations and works on this. I tried to bring together, and I did something very small concerning the feeding of the army for Russia. I'm not entering into details, but there is a misunderstanding about the importance, the non-importance of trade and capital in the steppe in this period, which was far greater than we always said. And on the other hand, there was much less capital in the West that we always said. First, that's why I was not schizophrenic when I left the Russian studies for some years, and I tried to finish. I took, unfortunately, a long time, 8 years, to finish this book called Rules of Exchange. Everything is in English, despite my accent, so this is a Cambridge book coming out on 12. It's about the rules of exchange is about the small amount of capital and difficulties in having capital in the West between the mid-17th century and the early 20th century. If you enter into details, and economic historians now of France or Britain and even Germany, they perfectly know that in details now, all the first industrial revolution was based upon small amount of capital, small units, and labor intensification. So much more labor and small amount of capital. We had even interdiction of stock exchanges, as you know, until the 70s, and the futures were forbidden, and you have many units which were based upon family size, and this was true everywhere. And even in the States, the increasing of big corporation was something of the 20th century. So the problem is that we, as usually, we use the 20th century perception and we put backward into previous centuries, but this was not the case. The 20th century, from this perspective, is something different, and the 19th century up to the First World War goes with the previous time. So, from this perspective, there is not a confirmation of the opposition between capital and coercion on the two sides. So the problem is, if it's not Chile, how do we think with the state formation out of Western Europe? And to give an extent, we may have a good conversation with people like Nicolas de Cosmo from Princeton, with his different works on state formation in Eurasia. And as you know, de Cosmo tried to provide an alternative to Chile for the state formation in Eurasia by putting the nomadic organization at the very core. And there is something really interesting for us to discuss Russia starting from de Cosmo, but there is one problem, and the problem is the following. De Cosmo explains the passage from one state organization to another, more complex, by using the notion of crisis and the limits of resources. Okay? So the nomads use all the resources, and then you need another state organization to bypass these limitations, and so on. This is true, but as you know, the notion of crisis itself, there were many other stories on this. Hobsbawm and Stinsgaard talk about the crisis of the 17th century, the transformation of the state as well. But people like Brodel and even Koselleck strongly criticized the Hobsbawm notion of crisis to explain the shift from one passage to another. It depends the crisis for whom and crisis for what. And the longue durée of Brodel puts you in a completely different way from the Hobsbawm and Marxist approach of a crisis of the 17th century, and so from feudalism to capitalism. You have much more continuities than break if you follow the longue durée approach. So the problem with de Cosmo is that on one end it gets out from the theory scheme and the deterministic and Eurocentric approach, and on the other end he put again into the table the idea of crisis and stages. And the problem of stages is still one of the major difficulties and concern related with Russian. And this is where precisely I want to move. If we move beyond the state, we have the second big category related to Russia, which is coercion. Okay? And the road to serfdom explains the passage from serfdom to communism and the persisting coercion. Coercion is something extremely interesting beside the state, precisely because you have this clear-cut opposition between freedom and unfreedom. It's interesting that the history of serfdom comes out from a very long tradition as well, and it's extremely related to the idea of backwardness. You know the general theories about serfdom, the idea of Kula or Wallerstein relating the emergence of serfdom to what's going on in Russia, but also serfdom as a way of feeding the capitalism in the West. So the more you have capitalism in the West, the more you have serfdom in the East. This was the conventional scheme, trying to relate the two. Now, the idea is, well, first, if this is true or not, and second, which is the origin of this idea of relating in this way coercion in the East and freedom in the West. Again, I started with a very simple idea. I had difficulties in finding in Russian sources the term itself, serf, krepostное право, in the 18th century. I found a lot in the sources after the 40s of the 19th century, when we discuss about abolition. Before, all the sources speak about peasants or rural population. Now, of course, you can translate Christiania with serfs. My question was, why didn't call them serf? It was not a problem of censorship, they didn't care. So why this word, and who spoke about serfdom in the West? And it's extremely interesting because the first who really spoke about this was again Montesquieu in L'Esprit de Loi, again, and he said, listen, now France under Enlightenment is changing. We have no more serf as in medieval time, but we have peasants. And he argued there is a similarity between space and time. As in France we move from serf to peasant, in the backward East Oriental Europe there are still serf, and they need enlightenment. So there was a double operation, the invention of a mythical serf in France and the identification of a serf in the East. So the past and the East were backwardness. So the invention of serfdom in Montesquieu approach was not an historical category, was an analytical and political category. Marc Bloch already studied this in the early 20s when he said, what is it the expression serf de la glèbe in French? He said, I don't find in medieval sources, so what is it from? And precisely found out the invention of Montesquieu of inventing something called serf de la glèbe, which was never used in French medieval time, never. So there was an important operation achieved during the Enlightenment. So on one end you have the backwardness, on the other end you have freedom and non-freedom and serf. The most important is that these discussions were always global at the time. For the Enlightenment, there was the universal mankind, and they related three different topics that we historians always separate. They related serfdom in the East, guilds in France, and slavery in the colonies. To them, these were one single problem, the problem of freedom and labor. Okay? But today we have historians of slavery, historians of serfdom, and historians of guilds. And we separate the three. But to them, this was one single problem. And it was one single problem which was solved in the same way. Before the late 80s, most of the French philosophers were absolutely not radical. They were for a slow transition from serfdom to freedom, from slavery to freedom, but absolutely not immediate. They became radical and revolutionary very late. Before this, they discussed about the opportunity and the eventual trade-off between economic advantages and free labor. Adam Smith's story of the superiority of wage labor was Adam Smith's idea, but many others didn't accept this at all, including Bentham, that's why I discussed about this, and many others, not only Russia, but in Europe, in France, they had huge doubt about the superiority from an economic point of view of wage labor compared to forced labor. This was an Adam Smith story, and nobody cared at that time about Adam Smith. As you know, all the abolitionist movement in England, in France was much weaker, but in England was achieved through ethical and religious stuff, exactly as in the state, not using the economic argument. The economic argument didn't work, and even economists at the time had huge doubt about superiority of this. And today, as you know, you have, since at least 30 years and time on the cross, an empirical analysis showing that slavery was profitable, exactly as many other forms of coercion. So the idea is that we should try to bring Russia in by showing what. What I'm trying to do is the following. I'm not entering into details, otherwise I'm never finishing, so I'm trying to stop in a moment. The idea is the following. The first is that to rework about serfdom in its different perspective and levels, the institutions of serfdom, the implementations of institutions, and how it worked on concrete estates. To be brief, the final conclusion I have is the same that medievalists have for Europe, which is you have not a central institution of serfdom, of course, in Russia. You never have the central law about this. You have forms of local racketing or extortion, which means I have all list of interdiction. In theory, you cannot marry outside of the estate, you cannot trade, you cannot do, and so on and so forth. But if you enter into the accounting of the estates, what I try to do for some estates, not all of them, okay, but for some estates, is that fees from allowing peasants to do that are one of the most important revenues of landlords. So it's just like racketing. You can do, but if you pay, you do. And they paid, and they did. So it's another story. After we can discuss about the efficiency of mafia, which is a completely different topic, and extortion in relation with economic growth. And this is another topic, because for economists it's absolutely non-correct to have a form of extortion, otherwise you have an unequal distribution and the growth slow down. But yet you have many historical situations in which this worked, southern Italy, Latin America, and many other situations like Japan, despite mafia, corruption, and extortion, they did not so bad. And China as well, and Russia as well today. After it's a problem of distribution, not of growth. And that's my problem. The problem is that if we focus only on growth, we miss something which is extremely important. And the history of Russia should help us in reframing the political philosophy underlying economics. And in particular, the passage from distribution and inequality to efficiency and growth. So, what I show is that serfdom was much more flexible and was not the ideal type. On the other hand, I worked a lot on Britain, France, rural France, and since 7 years on labor in the Indian Ocean, to show the evolution from slavery to indentured immigration, okay? So, the most important is that coercion was something which was extremely important, not only in the colonies, but in Europe itself, where, as you probably know, the Master and Servants Act was the base of labor markets in Britain. They were not an heritage of medieval time. They were enhanced in the 18th century to control the mobility, and they were enforced. We have now a lot of studies on local archives showing how the masters, not employers, used the law to oblige local workers not to move, because they were concerned of a major problem, which was not proletarization. Marx and Smith were absolutely wrong on this until the second half of the 19th century, not only in Russia, but not only in France, that we know this, but even in Britain, you have a continuous moving between the countryside and the town. The real proletarians were a tiny minority, and they exploded only with the second industrial revolution, not with the first one. And what I'm trying to show since some years is that actually all the growth between the mid-17th century and the late 18th and 19th century actually was a labor-intensive growth, not only in Russia, not only in Asia, but also in Western Europe. Everybody wanted more labor. That is why labor time is increasing. That is why everybody is fighting because of proto industry, of manufacture, of agriculture, services, and the army. Everybody wanted arms, and their obsession was débauchage, or they are taking my people. All the masters, not only of slaves, but all the employers, even in Britain, were concerned with the fact that people moved without their authorization, and the other textile entrepreneur wanted their arms and their people. And they cannot move without their authorization. So I'm not talking about serfdom, I'm talking about England and servants. And I'm not saying that servants are serfs. It's completely different what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that first there were important statute legal inequalities between people, extreme in Russia, extreme in the colonies, but still important in Western Europe, as you know, where women had not the same rights as men, children forget about it, and access to the law was not the same according to the property, and this was until the early 20th century. So you have important inequalities of law, and you have important differences on the labor market about the possibility of using the law to preserve your rights. So from this perspective, I explain this because first an economic argument, which is labor intensive, and the intensification, everybody wants labor, and so you have these rules and this enforcement. But second, you have another argument, is that not only Russia, but even in England and in France, labor was not only legally, but also socially considered as a service, which means that the servant or the worker should give all the time of the contract to the master. So time was the most important concern, and not so much the quality of labor. This is the second industrial revolution again. So it comes later. So because of this, I'm trying to bring Russia not as something which is beyond the world, but like the European colonies, as an extreme solution to a common problem, an extremely unequal solution, but still the inequalities, legal inequalities, were extremely important in Europe itself. So to conclude, Russia was with Europe and its colonies until the end of the 19th century. And they could perform, with coercion, a good enough growth. And now we have good data on this. They had good growth in the 18th century. They had even better growth after the abolition of serfdom. But my problem is, so what? If growth is our concern, this is very good, and we might say that Tsarist Russia or China today are very good countries because despite coercion you have a huge growth. But to me, this is a problem in which we use economics to make history. My problem is, what if we shift the focus and instead of stressing I need growth all the time, I say what about inequalities and rights, not only economic inequalities, but also individual rights for different actors. The good invention of economists was that in an ideal world, freedom, capitalism, and economic growth go together. In this case, we are in a perfect world, and we can save everything. But my problem is that historically, we have a trade-off between the two. We can have good growth with no democracy, no rights, and a lot of coercion. So if we have a trade-off, we must choose. And what we choose? Growth or rights? I prefer rights. But this is the open question, and this is where Russia becomes crucial.
Thank you, Sandro. Let me ask you the first question.
Okay.
In terms of the categories, like when do you start seeing coercion versus liberty, freedom? When do you see these actually emerging as the pairing? I mean, historically, when does this? I mean, when does it become important to consider whether or not a regime is coercive or whether the economy functions like coercion?
Okay. For the coercion, it depends on the world, of course, and the word you use. The first, as I said, the free and free labor was a typically 18th century debate, and they used the terms exactly to say in guilds they are obliged and there is coercion because you keep the people there, you keep apprentices, and they are not free to move, and there is a coercion. Slaves are under coercion, and so on and so forth. Yet it's an important discussion because if you use in an internalist way, I'm going to explain. Internalist means how people of the time use the categories, okay? And after you have an externalist approach, much more widespread in sociology or economics, by saying I define coercion, and after I see if whether there is coercion or not, okay? Two different ways. In the second way, it's extremely interesting because when you speak with sociologists, many of them say, okay, coercion is the obligation to work. And to some of them, coercion is obligation to work in a certain way instead of in another, which means the machines, the industries, and so on and so forth. But to me, this is a great problem because from this standpoint, everything is coercion. As soon as you are a wage earner, you are under coercion. But this is not you, again, because if I use an internalist approach as an historian, again, in the 19th century, many actors of the time considered that the real slavery was wage labor. This was an argument that planters in the American South used against the abolition to say, listen, you want to free slaves, they are better than wage earners because wage earners are the slaves. But this was also widespread in Europe as well, where many people spoke of wage earners as coercion and so as disguised slaves. So the definition, the historical definition of coercion is the crucial to me.
Following that, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, how Russian economists or Russian historians at the time, as you said, if they were in the 18th century, 19th century, understood Russian economy. Because perhaps, that's the problem.
Yeah.
We keep speaking about, Russian economy in the French
Yeah.
and the Western.
Exactly. So, okay, it can be a whole talk because it's a real problem. I'll just give a couple of examples. For the 18th century, the most useful was how Russian, but mostly were German, economists ranked Smith, Bentham, or other Western theories. The first is that they translated these theories through the lens of cameralism. And so Smith became something a little bit different through the using of the state to implement the reforms and achieving free labor through the state, exactly as the cameralist said. So the idea of forced reforms was something extremely widespread among Russian reformers and economists of the late 18th, early 19th century. After you have, and this is even more interesting, the idea of backwardness exactly was not only a Western idea, but precisely Russian people, I would say economists, but actually, as you know, at the time, the economist didn't exist here in the West. They had multiple fields. They did not qualify themselves as economists, and they put into big social sciences. But so you have all the debate about the modernization of Russia, and this is well known. But the most interesting to me is not only that they could keep some ideas from the West, but also the other angle, how Western theories could be influenced by the way Russians thought the same problem. So the most interesting is the two ways. And the first way is precisely how the populists of the Marxists, and liberals thought about Western theories. And there the most interesting story is why the market rose so many problems to all of them. Why utilitarianism was so opposed into the late Tsarist Russia, and not only by Marxists, by everybody. So to me this is important to understand why they were against. The second is, there is an interesting story to do, and I'm finishing this, about the translation of terms coming from the West. It's a key to understand how Russians did it. I tried to do many years ago the way different Russian authors translated Marx and the difficulties they have in converting wealth into a Russian word. And precisely there were different editions of the Capital in which they used progressively two different words to say, well, ценность and стоимость. And as you know, in Russian, one is only value, the other is value and cost of production. And this changes everything, because between, okay, I'm not entering into it, but it's extremely interesting, between the first and the third tome of Das Kapital, you have the passage, as you know, from the theory of only value and labor to a theory of cost of production, okay? But the Russians translate it into a different way. So they transformed value into cost of production. And this was a huge heritage for the interpretation of what Marxism is in the Soviet Union. So the two ways, it's interesting. On one hand, what I said at the beginning of my talk about how Russia and Soviet Union inspired people in the West, Gershon, Montesquieu, and the other way is what you mentioned, how the Russians reworked all this. But
okay. Thanks for your talk, which I found really interesting. I work on similar questions in the British tradition. You mentioned Coercion, and I only know a little bit of Coercion, but the one thing I know I've read talks about his is when he's talking about he's problematizing notions of modernization by introducing the notion of various paths. And so backwardness introduces multiple paths forward, depending how far backward a particular state is deemed to be. And your account is really doing something very different, which is it's not seeking to introduce variability, it seems to me, in historical development, but trying to dissolve the features which would cordon off this particular case. And so you're trying to normalize a particular case rather than introduce multiple cases. And my question is there a cost in that approach to still accepting some historical norm to which you're trying to integrate Russian history? Are you still, it wasn't explicit, but aren't you implicitly assuming that there, or are you implicitly assuming that there's a historical norm of development, which is broadly Western European, and we haven't been able to see it for certain reasons because we haven't seen coercion in the West, or we haven't seen domestic service as being a kind of serfdom. But if we can overcome those kind of, if we can think more broadly in terms of those categories, what we see is that Russia belongs in a story that is Western European, and is that really, that surely is not what you're aiming at, but that kind of seems like where the logic goes.
Okay, great question. Okay, it's the core of my worries. I follow you about the multiple paths of Gerschenkron, of course. And I'm trying to move a little bit after this by using these steps that maybe can be used, and after I'm coming back to your question. First, how Gerschenkron thought about his evidence. What is evidence to him? And evidence is, on one hand, an ideal type of Britain. So he didn't care so much about economic history, but said, okay, there is the private property, there is this, so an ideal type. It starts from an ideal type. And what if, as I'm saying, we enter into details, and I study and I spend my time to study not only Russia, but also real Britain without trusting British historians working on Britain and say, okay, what are doing there? So you need more time, but after you have an empirical lack of confirmation. So first is entering this. Second, the fact that Gerschenkron used, as all people, and this is another concern that we have in Philadelphia with our joint panel, the statistics produced by the Zemstvo in the central state, because he read some Russian, of course. And I tried to make the history of statistics not just to deconstruct statistics, this is the first point, but how to show how the construction of the historical fact, as quantitative approaches argue, can be used to make social history. So without having a fact and perception on one end, but the construction of a fact through statistics. Gerschenkron did this, and I'm trying to show how statisticians themselves in Russia used this approach to invent a fact and a progress. So this is the other way around. And the third and the last is I'm trying to push something which is called reciprocal comparison. There is a paper also in Ab Imperio on this published 1 year ago. Reciprocal comparison is a term that Pomeranz already used by saying we need to study China in a different way, so we need a reciprocal comparison, okay? But I don't agree with his definition of reciprocal, because his reciprocity is inside the pensée unique. After the collapse of the world, the Chinese are even more capitalist than we are. All people in the world think the same way. This is the reciprocal comparison of the Great Divergence. What I'm saying is completely different. I say, instead of asking like Gerschenkron, why Russia doesn't do like this, why Russia, or even China, why they don't act like Europe? This is the normal question. Why don't have private property? Why don't have this? I try to reverse the angle, to provoke a little bit my friends from my department working on Britain or France, but it's not only provocation. I say, listen, they didn't do so bad, okay? So they have serf, and they did well with serf. And a lot of countries did very well with coercion, without the protection of private property and so on. So my question is, why Britain needed enclosures? It was not necessary. So instead of saying that the rule is the enclosures, because it's rational. They didn't know it was rational. It was for other reasons beyond. Why they did it? Explain, starting from the Russian experience. Why didn't leave some serf in Britain? Why didn't leave some common fields? They could have profits with this. So why did they do it? And at the moment I have not yet answers, except if they were liberal even in the 13th century, of course.
Yes.
I was really fascinated by, your ending, very provocative, if you left it not fully elaborated about the inverse relationship between rights and economic growth. And I'm just wondering to what extent this relationship is qualified and specific to the period or the type of state capitalist like you do, because we did have a graph of the Soviet economic growth rates, which seemed also to follow that inverse relationship with the highest growth rates with the industrialization in the first couple of 5-year plans, and then subsequently falling, and we can assume that the coercion in the late Soviet Union was much less. And this reminded me very much of a point Vivek Chiber, an economic sociologist, made recently, that socialist states, socialism took hold in states that were historically backward, whether Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and for those states the imperative of economic growth often trumped any democratic promises they had earlier, and so he essentially blamed the in some way failure of the socialist project in those states to the fact that these were backward economic zones in the first place. So to what extent is the relationship you posited between growth and rights applicable in different types of states?
No, it's a very good question. I started from the 90s as usually, and in the 90s there were all these debates about the transition. Transition in itself is an interesting term because you know the origin and you know where you have to go. So it was already very, and as you know, in the 90s there was this debate whether you must start with democracy or with growth, and which was the first. So this was the debate of the 90s. And so you see, you will have growth. At the beginning they said you need democracy. Without democracy you cannot have growth. After a couple of years, I said, okay, let's start with growth, and after they will have necessarily democracy. After, in particular, Russia did very well without democracy, and they had growth, so they didn't care at all. But this is an interesting story. It's an interesting story because it's my concern now, is over 3 centuries, even in the West, in different parts of Europe, this relationship between rights and growth, it's a really complicated one. Today you have, the return of inequalities with Piketty and economic and so on. But my concern is precisely the following. What we put inside rights, because you can have universal human rights, but which are the rights? And we compare growth, and we know more or less, but second, we don't know why growth and which rights are we talking about. And I think that the political but also philosophical history of rights in the West is an interesting one, because as you know, some people, Moyne and many others, stress the contradictions of the 18th century because French, but even Thomas Jefferson spoke about universal rights and they had slaves. This is right. The problem is that if you make history, contradictions are a logical problem, not an historical problem for myself, because what I'm trying to say is that for many people in France, and for Thomas Jefferson as well, there was no contradiction. It was perfectly legitimate to, according to their notion of that time of what human rights, to have slaves. I mean, they were not even human beings. So they say, what's your problem? I mean, they don't see the problem. And if you point all this, we don't understand the changing over time. But so the problem is another one. You have precisely all the liberal of the 18, which are different of the 19 and the 20. But in liberal movement was precisely rights, political rights above all, and civil rights. And as you know, social and economic rights were put beside, except by some radical during the French Revolution and many others, but this was beside. And this was still the case in the 19th century, when you said, okay, you are all equal in front of the law, but liberals were against the Democrats, but not everybody needs to vote. This is another story. So the Democrats had the political rights, which were different than the civil rights. And socialists completely reversed and say, who cares about these rights. These are bourgeois. We need only economic rights. And Soviet Union, of course, took seriously this. They say, why you should give rights to these people? They don't need it. Just formal equal economic equality and no political rights because they are bourgeois. And you have this trade-off until nowadays, even in Europe, when people say, okay, illegal immigrants, many friends from the left say, why do you want to give them real rights of staying legally in Europe? They don't need. They need to be developed in their own countries. So, my question is precisely this, and Russia again is an extreme case. Why do we have so many difficulties in all different philosophical and political philosophy approaches to bring together all these different rights? They are all the time in opposition one with the other. Either I give priority to economic rights and social rights against political, or vice versa. And why is it so? To me, it's still an open question, but it's the question at the moment. Why is it so?
Yes.
I came in very late, but I want to get to the last kind of 10, 15 minutes of your presentation, which I thought reminded me a lot of Al Reber's work on the Great Reforms.
Yeah.
Which says that, you know, Russia is actually a pretty good model if you're maximizing military capacity until that model is no longer working. So I want to push back and ask you, something clearly changed in the mid-19th century. And I think where Gerschenkron comes in on this is that Gerschenkron is a Schumpeter reader. And he's revising Schumpeter. He's saying that investment can't be directed automatically through the entrepreneur. There has to be some state action. But he's still very much in a Schumpeterian and maybe, if you read Keynes away, to a Keynesian tradition. What he's saying is what Keynes is saying. Is sometime in the 19th century something changes. We go from Smithian growth, which everyone agrees is very labor intensive, there's not much capital around, to intensive growth, which is capital intensive, right? It's financialized, right? It's what we call a financialized economy. The question here maybe is the question maybe between, you know, rights and growth really so fundamental, or is it about the kinds of growth that are happening, right? And that means, you know, getting down and asking what are the institutions? What came first? Institutions that do coercive growth really well, or the growth itself? So instead of kind of moving to the rights level, can we be thinking about the kind of qualities, types of growth levels? They're not, you know, fungible resources to me, at least as an economist.
Great question, because, okay, the 3 points are very important. The first is something changed in the middle of the 19th century because of Second Industrial Revolution, because of the abolition of serfdom. I'm not following entirely Reber and Gerschenkron on this. What I'm showing is that he had much more continuities than break between the first half and the second half of the 19th century. I am a much more Arno Meyer than Reber from this perspective, and following this, on one hand I show that not even in Russia but also in Europe, the old aristocracy and the Ancien Régime really collapsed with the First World War, not before, but also what I'm trying to show is that in Russia, as in Eastern Elbia and Prussia, you have a good dynamics, not only because of peasantry, even under serfdom, but also because of estate owners who were much more innovative than we said before. In other words, in the Schumpeter and Gerschenkron approach, you have the old land aristocracies against innovation, and after you have the entrepreneur. What I'm trying to bring back is not because I like them, but it's just to complexify the transition from one to another, is that after all, not only peasants, but also land aristocracies, like Confino already showed, were much less opposite to innovation than we usually said. The difference is that, for example, in the 18th and early 19th century, what they did, they thought like many other people in the West, entrepreneur. I mean, that's why I worked on rules of exchange. The idea of having a monopoly and having a competition which is a closed competition. This was everywhere. And Russian landlords, what they did, said, this proto-industry and markets also for wheat, for cereals, for proto-industry, they are very interesting stuff. What I want is the monopoly of this with my peasants, and what I want is that urbans are out of this. So everybody said they are against innovation. They were for innovation and to control as a monopoly, not leaving to the town. After we must discuss whether it's only in town or you can have another model of putting out system. But this was, the first. And this impact your second questions about institutions and right. It's crucial, I'm a little bit skeptical about neo-institutionalism. That to me it's another tautological model, because you have this, after you have that. Okay, maybe it's true, but I don't prove anything. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the role of institutions that way. And on the contrary, which rights for whom? This is crucial. And I'm a little bit critical about the expansion of the welfare state, and I'm coming back to institutions too, because actually the welfare was very selective in Europe, extremely selective. At the beginning of the 19th century was just for a few workers of big units, everybody else was excluded. In the interwar they tried to open up, but precisely the origins of the Nazi and the communism was not only the collapse of the peasantries of the small, but also the fact that this collapse of ancient aristocracy was not sustained by the universal welfare, but a selective one. So the welfare is not the solution, at least the national and very local welfare. So I follow you by saying which institutions and which rights for whom, if this was the origin. But maybe you had something more in mind?
I could follow up, but I think there are other questions. Barbara.
Well, thank you. That was I love this kind of talk. This is, it gives you so much to think about. And obviously, because you're doing something so big, you leave yourself open to a lot of different kinds of challenges. I think for me, I work on Brazil, and I'm particularly interested in 19th and 20th century Brazil, and I think Brazil is an interesting case, by the way, because it makes the transition away from, or that people don't even like using the transition term for it anymore, but you have the abolition of slavery very late, 1888, and so you really do get in Brazil people talking about we need to abolish slavery because it's backward and we won't develop as an economy. So you don't get just the moral, religious argument because of the timing of it. But I guess my kind of broader question is that I felt that there is a lot of slippage in your talk between actually talking about coercion as an aspect of labor and coercion as a metaphor. So, for example, I would totally disagree with what you're saying about wage slavery being seen as the real slavery in the 19th century. I believe not only is, and I think the internalists, externalists, they are using it as a metaphor. They do not see themselves as equivalent to slaves. They're clearly using it as a way of saying, this is so bad, it's almost making us like slaves. They know very well they are not slaves and that their situation is not as bad as that of slaves. So when workers are using it or people are supporting labor. So, and that's one of the problems I have with your discussion of coercion. I mean, I certainly wouldn't disagree about the aspect of coercion in all labor relationships. But I do think that there is first of all an issue of degree, but I think even more so that using texts that give us a sense of metaphor, but not the economic relationship is an issue in terms of the various references you made. I don't know if you get it.
Yeah. No, I get point. Yes and not. I'm always skeptical when we must absolutely oppose, but probably is not your concern, representations and realities.
Yeah, no, that's definitely.
I know I mean, so, but that's
we can't
why.
use them the
Yes.
same way.
But no, we can't use in the same way. But what I'm interested in is the interrelationship between the two. And I'm coming back to this precisely. Who says that wage earners are slaves? When and how? So it depends on the author. Many people were just intellectuals, and they said this in some debates about abolition. This was true. Some union movements and abolition in Britain in particular used the same metaphor very late in the late 30s and in the early 40s in a particular context to express something about wage labor conditions and said we are slaves. Now, this was a metaphor and it was not true. About the metaphor, it was full of political implications, precisely as today. So, they tried to negotiate different, and we follow this. Even today, of course, when many people say there are slaves everywhere, sometimes it's a metaphor, but sometimes they present this metaphor as reality. And this is important. It's important because everybody's a slave, so nobody's a slave. And this is the technical implications. But what I'm doing myself is first level to say who says what. This is a metaphor, but with the full of political implication. Second level, beyond what they say, which was the level of coercion. And this is a completely different analysis, and they say, okay, but they have the Master and Servants Act, and they are not slaves. My position in the different chapters, but here I cannot, it's chapters on England, chapters on the indentured and so on, precisely what's going on the field, and I defend the idea that they really were disguised slaves, precisely because they have more voice, more rights, and the difference was what? That the social conditions could be the same, and as you know, after the abolition, the real economic and social conditions were even worse. But this does not mean that they were slaves. So I follow you on this. It's just a question of how do you develop at which level. But I follow you.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. And I have two very specific questions. First question is, what was the attitude in this debate of the economists? What was the attitude and evaluation of the period of Catherine II? Because then I wrote my research on the western provinces of the Russian Empire during her reign. We can see that this usage of coercive methods and attitude to peasantry was strongly linked with the borders. Because what we see during that period is the peasantry flew to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and these runaways choose landlords who promised them freedom, no military conscription. So to attract, to repatriate this peasantry, the empire used these methods which were strongly opposed to coercion. They granted them freedom, they attracted them back, and they even promised no taxes, no conscription, no nothing. And I even read about some cases of religious tolerance, so people from other denominations could be welcomed back to the empire. So I feel that this attitude is something different. But I guess the situation changed then. The borders were demarcated, enclosed, and the nobles in these provinces got more power, and they could serve the peasantry after this. And so what was the attitude to this period and these methods, which were quite nuanced and advanced compared to simply saying coercion versus no coercion? And second question is, there is a great debate between Russianists what was the breaking point in the periodization of Russian history. Some of them take 1861 and others think, well, we should prefer 1970. So your attitude and the new period of Russian history started.
And you have only 2 minutes to answer that question.
Okay, great.
First question.
Okay, Serfdom and Empire under Catherine. The attitude is completely different. What I can resume, is the following. As you know, they were related. The expansion of the empire under Catherine, the church and the church estates, and it was extremely important the evolution of instructia. I worked on this under Catherine, passing from I need to control the peasants and having some attitudes of them to I need to control the bailiff and intermediaries in order to avoid disruption. This was the general attitude. Within this, I didn't work on the western provinces, but Potyomkin, as you know, and Bentham. Bentham went to Potyomkin and states, and his invention of the panopticon was made precisely on Potyomkin, and this means related to Catherine and all the rest, and so the invention of panopticon was related to this. But the last, I didn't spoke, but we can talk about this. It's my concern that in the steppe, peasants had absolutely, not only the Abnavortsi, but all the others, more rights and entitlements as peasant soldiers than peasants in inland. And to this is to me extremely important because we have for this period the opposite than in the British American colonies. In the British American colonies, you have what? People moving out are much more for this period, they're not the free immigrants, they're indentured. They are much more bound than people in England itself when they move out. In Russia, it's just the opposite. People in the steppe are in a better condition than people in the heartlands. It's just the opposite. So the tension between rights and colonization is to me completely opposite in the British and the Russian expansion in this time. Okay? Periodization, I always follow my periodization. I bring all together the world between the mid-17th century and the late 19th century, and I include a great divergence with the Soviet Union in the 20th century, when the West moved, despite the social welfare and so on and so forth, moving to another path. And to me, the Soviet Union moved away, so 17 is a real break to me, because if I must summarize in 30 seconds, as I said, my definition of the Soviet Union is the method of the first industrial revolution with the organization of the second industrial revolution. That's Soviet Union. So more labor, long labor with machines. In the West, you have the passage from one to another. They try to put people longer on work without looking at the quality of labor. You stay there, it's a service, time is important, with big machines beside you. It's the Soviet synthesis of this.
Well, very good. Alessandro, thank you.
Thanks to you.